All right, so before I guess there's some issue about the chapter one, right? Since McGraw-Hill has a couple versions of their anatomy and physiology, and they all look very similar. I believe it was the wrong version that I posted. So let's take a look at this for 177 for net for just generally what I want you to know for chapter one. Now, in terms of anatomy physiology. I want you to know the difference between what is anatomy, what is physiology. So anatomy is just when we look at something, we are inspecting it. When we're touching something, we're palpating it. When we're auscultating, we're listening to it. When we're percussing, we're kind of using our own fingers to produce sound waves so that we can hear as our sound waves that we're producing goes through different parts of the human body. It will produce either a very hollow sound or very thick kind of a sound that makes it kind of allow us to perceive some of the differences between, let's say, something that's hollow, like your lungs, and something that is solid, like your heart. Now, with anatomy, anatomy is the what, right? So, anatomy is what? What do you see? That's gross anatomy. When you look at it with a microscope, that's either cytology or it's going to be histology. The physiology is the how and the function. How does that cell do what it's supposed to do? What does that cell do? What happens if that cell, right, eventually malfunctions? So when we talk about the malfunctioning, that's a pathophysiology. Physiology is just the actual study of how those cells that make us who we are function together. So again, right, when we take a look at the just the first couple slides, right, there's not a lot of quiz material on the first couple slides. So when we look, so it's not a lot of highlighted material, especially now that we covered too much in our lab lecture section on whenever we met. All right, now when we talk about just the overall hierarchy of structures here, keep in mind the hierarchy is simple. The simplest thing are the atoms. Those are proton, neutrons, electrons that eventually help form our elements. The elements then form bonds to form molecules. These molecules form external bonds with other molecules to form larger macromolecules like DNA, right? Again, when we have something special like carbon that forms a non-polar covalent bond, which we'll talk about later, keep in mind that these bonds between other molecules, and we're going to have a lot of them, allows us to have this superstructure that's much longer, like DNA, like proteins, right? Eventually, the DNA is going to code for organelles that are found within the cell, right? Mitochondria is a type of organelle, then the cell itself is a larger structure made out of all the different types of organelles. We have multiple cells that make up a tissue, and we have multiple tissue types that make up an organ. So cells, we're going to simple squamish, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. We're going to see multiple types of cells when we can talk about a tissue. Then we have organ types, which is basically a combination of different tissue. So in the stomach, what we can see in the stomach, whoops, what we can see in the stomach is that we have lots of the lining of the stomach is going to be full of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. The actual megastructure of the stomach right here, forming the outline, that smooth muscle. So that's already two different types of tissues helping form the organ right here. Now there are other ones. We'll see fat as well, right? We'll see some subcutaneous tissue here. And then we have multiple, right, organs and tissues forming the organ system. Like the GI tract, you have the stomach, but then you also have the liver, a different organ, the small intestines, a different organ, then you have the large intestines, and then the rectum, right? So that's an organ system. We have multiple organ systems like the GI tract, the respiratory tract, right? All forming the larger organism. Now, keep in mind that nobody is ever the same except for identical twins, right? Just keeping that in mind. We kind of discussed it before. Identical twins share the same DNA because they have the same egg, the same sperm cells. It fertilizes, right? It combines, and it should form during cell division. Well, it should form more like, let's say parts of a different person, Might sure only form one person, just different parts of that individual. But somehow, in some way, instead of forming parts of the same individual, it formed two people. So those two people that are formed, those identical twins, are from the same egg and sperm. So they have identical DNA. So they can never be of different sexes. And they should never, especially when they are, young, they shouldn't look too different from each other. Now, we talked about fraternal twins. Fraternal twins are different. They're like any brothers or sisters born on the same day. What makes them twins is that they're born on the same day. So we talked about anatomical variations. Some of them are conducive to life, some of them are not, right? Some of them are really bad, but we will all have some kind of variation. Now, characteristics of life, there's got to be some organization, there's got to be some cellular composition, there's got to be metabolism, responsiveness, some movement, right? Got to have homeostasis, which is what we will discuss a lot more about coming up. With homeostasis right here, so I'm just going to highlight this. I don't know why it wasn't highlighted. So some of the characteristics of life I want you to know are these ones at the very end. So I'm going to repost these with all the highlighted material as well. All right. So let me just highlight the rest of this chat on this slide. All right. Now let's talk about homeostasis. Homeostasis, best example of it is our body temperature. With homeostasis, it is our ability to detect change in our internal environment and activate mechanisms that oppose it. By activating mechanisms, we can then, right, have a little bit of deviation, but then we can bring our deviation closer to our normal state, right? So again, with homeostasis is the ability to detect change, then do something to oppose it. Right? We kind of use example of sweating, and we're going to use that example a lot more coming up. Usually, it requires negative feedback, and we'll talk about negative feedback in 1 second. Now, in terms of feedback loops, these are ways that our body either accelerates a condition or causes a condition to go in reverse. So when we talk about homeostasis right here, usually homeostasis wants us to kind of revert back to some kind of normal condition. An example, your blood pressure elevates, or right, you are working out, your blood pressure elevates for a little bit, and to make sure you don't have a bad results from working out, eventually we'll see a noticeable drop in blood pressure as a result of this. Right. So usually when we have homeostasis, that's a good thing. It requires negative feedback loops. Now, when we have a loss of homeostatic control, that's usually incredibly bad. Right. Let's give an example in a second about blood, our body temperature. Right. Negative feedback. In order to have negative feedback, you need receptors. You need a location where we can kind of note the change and cause a response, right? Usually in the brain. And then we're going to need a way to cause a reverse, kind of a way to oppose that deviation. Because feedback mechanisms alter the original changes that trigger them, they're called feedback loops. Homeostasis in body temperature, I'm just going to highlight this because I do want you to know this pretty well because you will see it again in our skin chapter. So, right, when we talk about a negative feedback requires some kind of receptor, and I believe its back is over here. Negative feedback requires some kind of receptor right here that kind of senses that change, right? That change in the body. So when we're using an example of body temperature, we have thermoreceptors that will monitor changes in your body temperature, right? So when your body temperature gets too hot, these thermoreceptor activates. As they activate, well, they activate because you went above a specific body temp now. What happens then? Well, we send a signal by way of sensory nerves. We send a signal to our hypothalamus, which is our main control center. This hypothalamus then will note that change and then decide, all right, you know what? There's too much of a deviation. Your body temperature is too hot right now. We need to cool it down. So it activates. So as it activates, it's going to cause some kind of effect to happen. So an effector is something as simple as a heart that allows you to beat faster, all right? Or it can be more complex, and we have a series of reactions occurring, which we will see when we talk about body temperature. So when we talk about body temperature, again, right? We're going to have this, right, body temperature set point of 98.6. That doesn't mean you're always at 98.6 throughout the course of your day. Throughout the course of the day, it could be higher, it could be lower. If it's higher, well, once we get to a certain set point or a certain point, you will start feeling terrible when your body temperature gets this elevated. So we don't want it to get above 100 because at that point, right, it doesn't matter if it's caused by having a virus and you have a fever, or it's caused by working out in the middle of the afternoon in a warm, hot, muggy day. Doesn't matter. All right. As soon as your body temperature elevates beyond 100, you are going to feel bad. If it goes way beyond 100, now we're at the risk of heat stroke, right? So, what do we want to do? What we want to do then is to somehow cause a retreat in your body temperature. So, if your body temperature gets too hot, we want it to eventually get to lower somehow. So, how do we lower it? Well, come with, all right, we kind of mentioned it. Two things happens. One, you sweat. By sweating, and if it's really hot, dry heat outside, that sweat evaporates on your skin because sweat is mostly water. As water evaporates in that region of our skin, what happens? That region then cools. So the hotter and drier it is, the faster we can release that, that sweat, and the sweat evaporates. So that's just one part of it. So once you have sweating, you cool the temperature of your surface of the skin in that area you're sweating. Then you also have your blood vessels close to the surface. They increase in size. We call that dilating. So they vasodilate. As they vasodilate, now you have all that warm blood. And now, because you're dilating the blood vessel, there's a lot more of that blood going through. And now you have that warm blood and it's dilating. It makes it closer to the surface of your skin. So you have warm blood going through the very, very surface of the skin. The skin itself is cool because of evaporation. Now that warm blood can radiate the heat out of your body into the environment. Perfect, right? As you radiate and radiate the heat out, your body temperature cools. Eventually, to prevent us from sweating too much and then, radiating too much heat, so then we get hypothermia, we're going to have an opposite effect here. So you're going to cool the body down and then you're going to stop sweating because remember, you're already too cool at this point. So we want to prevent you from getting cold from sweating, which shouldn't happen, right? So what do? We vasoconstrict the blood vessels, we stop sweating. Combination of both. By stopping sweating, we no longer are going to have this big, kind of difference between temperatures on the skin and in the environment, right? So you no longer have this coolness of the skin, at least not as cool. Secondly, by vasoconstricting, you redirect blood flow away from the blood vessels next to the skin, right? When that happens, now you're going to detour it back to much deeper areas, right? As you detour the blood to the deeper areas, you're further away from the skin, so you stop radiating the heat away. You retain it at that point. So as you keep the blood deep in the blood vessel, deep in our body, you don't radiate that heat. And if you get really cold, you'll even start to shiver. Shivering causes the muscle contractions to occur, and muscle contractions increases body heat. So that combination of retaining that blood deep internally, shivering, which is basically uncontrolled muscle contractions. The sole purpose of those muscle contractions is to produce heat. So that combination will cause a rise back towards normal. So again, when you get warm, you sweat, you vasodilate, all that excess body heat. As you cool down, You stop sweating, you vasoconstrict. So then you can retain body heat. If you get too cold, then we start shivering. And the muscle contractions caused by shivering further increases the body heat. So we have this kind of up and down movement. That's homeostasis. It's an up and down movement. And when we take it over a course of 24 hours and average it out, then we're at the 98.6. Now, negative feedback is always a good thing, right? It allows us to have slight deviations from the norm, either high or low, and allows us to bring it back, all right, towards a normal set point. The bad things are positive feedback. Usually it's bad because it's self-amplifying, right? The only two times when it's not, when it's good is when we have childbirth and, for example, right, blood clotting, but blood clotting in a broken blood vessel, right, in a damaged blood vessel, meaning blood clotting that is appropriate, right? Every other time, it can be very dangerous, right? So let's talk about the good parts right here. So in the good example of positive feedback, what happens? Over here, mom's about to give birth. So as a baby ready to be born goes into the region of the uterus called the cervix, right? The baby's head hits the cervical opening and causes the cervical opening to increase in size. So now we dilate the cervix, right? What happens then? This dilation of the cervix then causes a signal to go to the hypothalamus. Again, hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus then causes your pituitary gland to release something called oxytocin. Oxytocin then is going to cause further contraction of the smooth muscle that makes up the uterus. So as the smooth muscle contracts, it causes the baby to go deeper into the cervical canal, causing more of a stretch of the cervix. That stretch of the cervix causes the hypothalamus to release even more oxytocin. This oxytocin then causes even greater contractions at much faster times, which causes even more, right, pushing of the baby's head into the cervix. Eventually, the cervix fully opens, and now we can push the baby out by this positive feedback loop. Again, right, this is a time when we do not want it to stop. So once baby has its head going into the cervical opening, we have to deliver the baby. So what happens? Well, we want to deliver the baby, and in order to do that, we need contractions of the uterine smooth muscle. This positive feedback cycle where you have stretch, then increased release of oxytocin, then increased contraction, then increased stretch, right? All of that will then amplify itself to eventually force the baby out, right? If it didn't amplify itself, there's a chance that the baby can get stuck in the right birth canal. And then that's deadly for mom and baby. And we talked about it as well, right? Right after you're born now, right? Right after you've given birth, mom now has this huge increase in oxytocin going down the bloodstream. Well, if you have that oxytocin, it's also known as the hormone of love. So you have a lot of oxytocin release. You're going to have this, all right? And now we've just cleaned the baby. Baby's healthy. We want to give baby right back to mom immediately. Why? Simple. All right. When mom has this increase of oxytocin, and now you give this cute little cuddly baby right next to mom, and you let mom hug the baby, immediately that combination of the hormones and touch with the baby usually engenders a lot more, right? Kind of a togetherness, a lot more love, a lot more bonding to occur. Right. Now you hear horror stories of people that had their, babies removed because the baby was born premature or baby is sick, and now we have to put them in the ICU, and mom can't touch the baby for a couple weeks. By that time, the oxytocin levels have dropped tremendously, and if the mom sees the baby later on without getting that oxytocin hit, it can be harder for mom to actually bond with the baby. Now, usually, right? When we talk about positive feedback loop, it can be dangerous, right? An example of this is hemorrhaging. When we hemorrhage, your blood pressure starts to drop, right? As your blood pressure starts to drop, then you start to lose more blood, right? As you start losing more blood, you also then, let me just write it down, right? So again, right, in positive feedback loops, it's self-fulfilling, self-amplifying cycle. So you hemorrhage. As you hemorrhage blood by bleeding through an artery, you expel a lot of blood out of that damaged blood vessel, right? So much blood exits that what occurs then is your blood pressure starts to drop. As your blood pressure drops, we send a signal to the brain. The brain tells the heart to work harder because without blood pressure, we can't bring blood to the brain and the brain dies. So the heart then contracts harder and with greater pulse, all right? Greater heart rate, even. So greater strength and greater speed. What happens then? You eject blood under a great amount of pressure, ejecting a lot of blood out. And now the blood pressure drops even more, which causes the brain to make the heart work even harder to eject even more blood out, which decreases the blood pressure even more. Eventually, you bleed out or exsanguinate. And now, right, this happens because of this positive feedback loop. Right. Now, I'll stop right here for homeostasis.